The Los Angeles sun was setting when Shaquille O'Neal's custom-built Ford truck pulled into the McDonald's parking lot on Sunset Boulevard. The restaurant's golden arches glowed brightly against the darkening sky. Shaq, as everyone called him, had just finished a long day of filming commercials, and his stomach was growling louder than a bear. The famous basketball player had to duck his head as he walked through the door. At 7 feet and 1 inch tall, this was something he had to do almost everywhere. The smell of French fries and burgers filled the air, making his mouth water. Even after all these years of fame and fortune, Shaq still loved the simple pleasure of a Big Mac meal. The restaurant was quieter than usual for a Friday evening. A few teenagers sat in one corner, their phones lighting up their faces. An old couple shared coffee near the window. But what caught Shaq's attention was a small boy sitting alone at a table meant for 4 people. The boy looked about 5 years old and wore a neat blue shirt with little rockets printed on it. His black hair was carefully combed, and his small feet, in light-up sneakers, didn't even reach the floor. In front of him sat an open Happy Meal box, but he wasn't playing with the toy. Instead, he was watching the kitchen with unusual focus for someone his age. As Shaq walked to the counter, he noticed something else strange. The workers behind the counter moved differently than usual. Their movements were too smooth, too perfect. It reminded him of those robot videos he had seen on the internet. When one worker turned to get his order, their smile seemed frozen, like a photograph. "Welcome to McDonald's. May I take your order?" The worker's voice was flat, like a computer reading words. "Yeah, let me get 2 Big Mac meals, supersized," Shaq said, trying to ignore the odd feeling in his stomach. He had learned to trust his instincts during his basketball career, and right now, those instincts were telling him something wasn't right. While waiting for his food, Shaq watched the small boy from the corner of his eye. The child was now drawing something in a notebook, his small hand moving quickly across the page. Every few seconds, he would look up at the kitchen, then back down at his drawing. When Shaq got his food, he decided to sit at a table near the boy. He told himself it was just to keep an eye on a child who seemed to be alone, but really, his curiosity was getting the better of him. As he unwrapped his first Big Mac, he noticed the boy's drawing. It showed strange symbols, like nothing he had ever seen before. The boy must have felt Shaq watching, because he suddenly looked up. His eyes were sharp and intelligent, not scared at all to see such a huge man sitting nearby. He carefully closed his notebook and placed it in his small backpack. "Are you really Shaquille O'Neal?" the boy asked in a clear, quiet voice. Shaq smiled his famous warm smile. "Yes, I am. But you can call me Shaq. Where are your parents, little man?" The boy's face became serious. "My name is Hansol Park. My parents are scientists. They'd been missing for 3 days." He spoke these words calmly, as if telling someone the weather. Shaq put down his burger, all thoughts of food forgotten. "Missing? Have you told the police?" Hansol shook his head slowly. "I can't. They're watching. They took Mom and Dad because they found out something important." He glanced at the kitchen again. "Who's watching, Hansol?" Shaq leaned forward, keeping his voice low. The boy didn't answer right away. Instead, he carefully packed up his remaining food into the Happy Meal box. Then he stood up and walked past Shaq's table, pretending to throw something in the trash can nearby. As he passed, he whispered words that made Shaq's blood run cold. "They're watching us from the kitchen, and they're not human." Shaq's first thought was that this was some kind of joke, or that the boy had a big imagination. But then he remembered the strange movements of the staff, their odd mechanical smiles. He looked toward the kitchen again. And this time, one of the workers was staring directly at him. Their eyes didn't blink. Hansol returned to his seat and pulled out a tablet from his backpack. He typed something quickly and turned the screen toward Shaq. On it was a complex-looking graph with spikes and dips. "My parents found these signals 3 days ago," Hansol typed on the tablet. "They come from this McDonald's." The next day, All the regular workers disappeared. These new ones arrived. Then Mom and Dad went missing. Shaq felt a chill run down his spine, despite the warm restaurant. He had dealt with all sorts of crazy situations in his life, but this was different. This was like something out of a science fiction movie. But looking at Hansol's serious face and remembering those unnaturally perfect movements in the kitchen, he couldn't just ignore it. "How do you know all this?" Shaq whispered, pretending to eat his fries. Hansol typed again. "Mom and Dad taught me everything. They knew something might happen. They told me to wait here each day until someone important came in. Someone people would listen to." The boy's fingers moved quickly across the tablet. "The signals got stronger 3 days ago. Mom and Dad's equipment detected something underneath the restaurant. They went to check, but they never came back." Shaq looked around the restaurant again. Now he noticed more strange things. The old couple by the window hadn't moved or touched their coffee in the last 10 minutes. The teenagers in the corner all scrolled their phones in exactly the same way, at exactly the same speed. "Why didn't you leave?" Shaq asked quietly. "They won't let me," Hansol typed. "Try walking to the door." Shaq stood up casually and walked toward the exit. As he got closer, 2 workers immediately moved to the drink station near the door, blocking his path without seeming to block it. Their movements were synchronized perfectly. He returned to his seat, his heart beating faster. This was real. Whatever was happening here, it was really happening. He looked at Hansol, who sat calmly watching him. "What do you want me to do?" Shaq asked, knowing he couldn't leave this brave little boy alone. Hansol typed one last message. "Call 911. But not here. Go to the bathroom. The signals are weaker there. Ask for Officer Jeho Kim. He worked with my parents before. Tell him code word Stardust Protocol." Shaq nodded slowly, understanding the seriousness of the situation. He stood up, careful to act natural. "Going to wash my hands," he said loudly, picking up his phone. As he walked to the bathroom, he felt eyes following him. Not just the workers' eyes, but also the old couples and the teenagers. None of them moved their heads, but their eyes tracked his movement. Just before he reached the bathroom door, he heard Hansol cough loudly, covering the sound of the door opening. Inside the bathroom, Shaq's hand shook slightly as he pulled out his phone. The screen flickered with strange interference, but he could still make out the numbers. He dialed 911, hoping this wasn't some elaborate prank, but knowing in his gut that it wasn't. As he waited for someone to answer, he looked at his reflection in the mirror. The face looking back at him was the same one that had stared down countless basketball opponents, the same one that had appeared in movies and commercials. But now it wore an expression he hadn't seen in a long time. Fear. The phone crackled with static, and a voice came through. 911. "What's your emergency?" Shaq took a deep breath and spoke quietly but clearly. "This is Shaquille O'Neal. I need to speak to Officer Jeho Kim. It's about the Stardust Protocol." There was a long pause on the other end. Then a different voice spoke. "This is Officer Kim. Mr. O'Neal, are you sure about what you just said?" "Yes," Shaq answered, glancing at the bathroom door. "I'm at the McDonald's on Sunset Boulevard. There's a 5-year-old boy named Hansol Park here. His parents are missing, and something very strange is happening. The workers, they're not normal." "Stay where you are," Officer Kim said sharply. "Keep Hansol safe. We've been waiting for this call. Whatever you do, don't let them know you've contacted us. Help is coming." The call ended, and Shaq stared at his phone. The screen was now filled with those same strange symbols Hansol had been drawing. As he watched, they seemed to move and shift, like they were alive. A knock on the bathroom door made him jump. "Sir, is everything okay in there?" The voice was too perfect, too measured. Shaq quickly washed his hands, trying to calm his racing heart. He was about to step into something big, something beyond his experience as a basketball star, actor, or businessman. But he knew one thing for sure. He wasn't going to leave that little boy out there alone. He opened the door, ready to face whatever waited on the other side. "Everything's fine," he said with his best camera-ready smile. "Just needed to wash up." As he walked back to his table, he caught Hansol's eye. The boy gave him the smallest of nods, and Shaq returned it. Now all they had to do was wait for help to arrive, and hope that whatever these things in the kitchen were, they wouldn't realize what was happening. The sun had fully set outside, and the restaurant's fluorescent lights hummed quietly. Shaq sat down and picked up his cold burger, pretending everything was normal. But nothing was normal anymore. Not since a 5-year-old boy had whispered 7 words that would change everything. "They're watching us from the kitchen, and they're not human." 10 minutes had passed since Shaq's phone call to Officer Kim. The McDonald's restaurant felt like it was frozen in time. The teenagers still hadn't looked up from their phones, and the old couple's coffee cups remained untouched. Even the ice in their drinks hadn't melted. Shaq pretended to eat his cold food while watching Hansol. The boy had taken out his notebook again and was drawing more of those strange symbols. His small hand moved with purpose, like he was copying something he had seen many times before. "Can you tell me about your parents?" Shaq asked quietly, trying to sound casual. He needed to understand more about what was happening. Hansol looked up from his drawing. "Mom and Dad work at the big science lab outside the city," he whispered. "They study space signals. Not the normal kind from stars, but the weird ones that nobody can explain." As Hansol spoke, one of the workers began cleaning tables nearby. Their movements were too perfect, like a robot in a factory. They wiped each table with exactly the same motion, taking exactly the same time for each one. 3 days ago, Hansol continued, his voice barely audible, "Mom's computers found something strange. The signals were coming from right here, under this McDonald's." He pointed down at the floor. "Dad said it was impossible because the signals looked like they were from really far away, like another galaxy." Shaq nodded slowly, remembering all the sci-fi movies he had watched. But this wasn't a movie. This was real. "What happened next?" he asked. "Mom and Dad came here to check," Hansol said. "They brought their equipment at night when the restaurant was closed. They found a hidden door in the kitchen floor." The boy's eyes filled with tears for the first time. "They told me to stay with our neighbor, Miss Song. They said they would be back in an hour. But they never came back." A crash from the kitchen made them both jump. One of the workers had dropped a tray of cups, but instead of cleaning it up, they just stood there, staring at the mess. After exactly 30 seconds, they bent down and picked up each piece, moving like a machine following a program. The next day, Hansol continued. All the regular workers were gone. These new ones showed up. They look like people, but they're not right. Watch their eyes. Shaq carefully observed the worker cleaning tables. They never blinked. Not once. Their eyes moved in quick, sharp movements, like cameras focusing on different points. "What about the other customers?" Shaq asked, glancing at the teenagers and the old couple. "They're not real either," Hansol said. "They show up every day at the same time, sit in the same places, do the same things. They're like decorations, to make the restaurant look normal." As if to prove his point, all 4 teenagers suddenly stood up at exactly the same time. They walked to the door in perfect sync, their steps matching exactly. The door opened before they reached it, and they walked out into the darkness. "Mom and Dad knew something like this might happen," Hansol said, pulling something from his backpack. "It looked like a small metal box with blinking lights. They gave me this. It detects the signals they were studying. It's been getting stronger every day." The box made no sound, but the lights on it pulsed in a steady pattern. Hansol placed it on the table between them, hiding it behind Shaq's food tray. "Look at this," the boy said, pointing to a small screen on the box. Numbers and graphs moved across it, changing rapidly. Mom said if the numbers ever went above 1,000, it meant they were very close. Right now, it's showing 2547. Shaq felt the hair on the back of his neck stand up. What exactly are we dealing with here, Hansol? Dad called them the observers, Hansol replied. He said they'd been watching humans for a long time, learning about us. But they're not supposed to interact with us. They're breaking their own rules by being here. A new customer walked into the restaurant. Like the teenagers who had left, something was off about them. Their movements were too smooth, their smile too fixed. They walked to the counter and ordered in a voice that sounded like it was copied from a recording. How do you know so much about this? Shaq asked, amazed at the boy's knowledge. Mom and Dad taught me everything, Hansol said proudly. They said knowledge is the best protection. They made me memorize all the important stuff, just in case. His face became serious again. They also said if anything happened to them, I should wait here until someone important came in. Someone who could help. Shaq understood now. That's why you're still coming here every day. You were waiting for someone like me. Hansol nodded. People listen to you. You're famous. If I told the police alone, they wouldn't believe me. But if Shaquille O'Neal tells them, he left the sentence unfinished. The boy was smart. Very smart. Shaq had met many intelligent people in his life, but this 5-year-old was something special. No wonder his parents had trusted him with so much information. Suddenly, the metal box started blinking faster. The numbers on the screen jumped to 3,000, then 3,500. Something's happening, Hansol whispered, his eyes wide. The signals are getting stronger. The lights in the restaurant flickered. The old couple by the window vanished, simply disappeared as if they had never been there. Their coffee cups remained on the table, still full, still steaming. They're dropping the pretense, Hansol said, his voice shaking slightly. They know we know. The workers behind the counter stopped moving. All of them turned their heads at the same time to stare at Shaq and Hansol. Their faces were completely blank now, like mannequins. What do we do? Shaq asked, fighting the urge to grab Hansol and run. He knew they wouldn't make it to the door. We wait, Hansol said firmly. Officer Kim is coming. Dad said he knows about the observers. He's dealt with them before. The temperature in the restaurant began to drop. Shaq could see his breath in the air. The metal box was now showing numbers above 4,000. They're going to open it soon, Hansol said, staring at the kitchen floor. The door to their observation post. That's where Mom and Dad are. The workers began moving again, but differently now. Their movements were no longer human-like at all. They glided across the floor as if floating. Their faces started to shimmer, like bad television reception. Don't look directly at them, Hansol warned. That's what they want. They can make you see things that aren't real. Shaq kept his eyes on the table, but he could see reflections in the window. The workers were changing, their human appearances melting away like wax. The metal box suddenly let out a high-pitched tone. The numbers on the screen were all zeros now. They're here, Hansol whispered. A sound came from the kitchen, like metal grinding against metal. Through the kitchen window, Shaq could see the floor opening up, revealing a staircase made of something that looked like liquid metal. 2 figures emerged from the opening. They wore what looked like business suits, but their movements were wrong, impossible. Their heads turned completely around to look at Shaq and Hansol. Hello, Hansol Park, one of them said in a voice that sounded like many voices speaking together. We have been expecting you to bring help. Your parents are very persistent in their non-cooperation. Hansol grabbed Shaq's hand under the table. His small fingers were trembling, but his voice was steady when he spoke. Where are they? They are safe, the second figure said. They are helping us understand human behavior, just as we have been studying humans in this eating establishment. This is wrong, Hansol said firmly. You're not supposed to interfere. Those are your own rules. The figures tilted their heads at exactly the same angle. Rules can be changed when the situation requires it. Your parents discovered our presence. Adjustments had to be made. Shaq squeezed Hansol's hand gently, letting him know he wasn't alone. The boy squeezed back. "The police are coming," Shaq said, finding his voice. "Real police. They know about you." "Yes," the figures said together. "Officer Jae-ho Kim. He has encountered us before, but he cannot stop what is already in motion. The observation post is being activated. Soon, this location will no longer exist in human memory." The metal box in front of them started smoking. Hansol quickly grabbed it and shoved it back in his backpack. "Your parents' equipment is impressive," one figure said, "but primitive, like all human technology." "If it's so primitive," Hansol said, "how did they find you?" The figures were silent for a moment. Then the first one spoke. "That is one of the things we are trying to understand. Your parents should not have been able to detect us. Yet they did. This makes them interesting." Sirens sounded in the distance. The figures turned their heads toward the sound. "It seems we must accelerate our timeline," they said together. "Hansol Park, you will come with us. Your parents are asking for you." "No," Shaq said, standing up. Even at his full height, the figures were taller. "The boy stays with me." "Shaquille O'Neal," the figure said, "your presence here was unexpected. You are significant in human culture. Perhaps you should join our study as well." The sirens were getting closer. Red and blue lights flashed outside. "You have approximately 30 seconds to make your decision," the figure said. "Come willingly, or we will be forced to use less pleasant methods of persuasion." Hansol looked up at Shaq, then at the kitchen where his parents were being held. The figures waited, their not quite human faces showing no emotion. The decision would have to be made quickly. But as Shaq looked down at the brave 5-year-old boy beside him, he knew there was only one choice he could make. The red and blue lights from the police cars painted the McDonald's windows like a light show. Officer Jae-ho Kim stepped out of his vehicle, his hand resting on his gun. Behind him, more police cars arrived silently, their sirens off now. The officers moved quietly, surrounding the building. Inside, Shaq stood his ground in front of Hansol, facing the two figures that were no longer pretending to be human. Their suits rippled like water, and their faces had become smooth, featureless surfaces that reflected the fluorescent lights. "Your law enforcement cannot help you," the first figure said, its voice echoing strangely. "They do not have the capability to interfere with our work." Hansol tugged on Shaq's sleeve. "The box," he whispered. "Mum's device. It can disrupt their signals." The figures tilted their heads, listening. "The child knows too much," they said together. "This validates our decision to study his family more closely." Shaq reached slowly into Hansol's backpack and pulled out the metal box. It was hot to the touch now, vibrating with energy. The numbers on its screen were spinning wildly. "You don't understand humans very well," Shaq said, holding the box carefully. "If you did, you'd know that taking children from their parents is something we won't allow. Your species is protective of its young," the second figure acknowledged. "An interesting trait we have observed, but irrelevant to our mission." Outside, Officer Kim spoke into his radio. "All units hold position. Wait for my signal." He knew what they were dealing with. He had seen it before, 5 years ago in Seoul, but this time they were better prepared. Inside the restaurant, the temperature continued to drop. Frost formed on the windows, blocking the view from outside. The figures began to move closer, their feet not touching the ground. "Last chance," they said in unison. "Come willingly, or we will take you by force." Hansol reached into his pocket and pulled out something that looked like a small remote control. "Dad gave me this too," he said. "He said only to use it if I saw them in their real form." The figures stopped moving. For the first time, they showed something like concern. "That device," they said. "Where did your father get it?" "From you," Hansol said, "from your last visit to Earth. He found it in the woods near our house." Shaq looked at the small remote in Hansol's hand. It was made of the same liquid metal material as the staircase in the kitchen. Strange symbols glowed on its surface, the same ones Hansel had been drawing. Outside, Officer Kim received a message on his special communicator, the one that couldn't be tracked or intercepted. The message was from Dr. Kita Park, Hansol's father. It had been scheduled to send automatically if he didn't reset it every 24 hours. If you're reading this, we've been taken. The device we discussed is with Hansol. He knows how to use it. Keep him safe. And Jeho, they're not just observing anymore. They're preparing for something bigger. Officer Kim grabbed his special equipment from the trunk of his car. It looked like regular police gear, but it had been modified with technology recovered from previous encounters with the observers. Inside, the figures had backed away slightly from Hansol and Shaq. "The device you hold is not meant for humans," they said. "Return it, and we will consider releasing your parents." "No," Hansol said firmly. "Mom and Dad said never to trust them when they offer deals. They don't understand promises." Shaq was amazed at the boy's courage. Here he was, 5 years old, standing up to beings from another world. It reminded him of all the times people had told him he couldn't do something, and he proved them wrong. "How about we make a different deal?" Shaq suggested, remembering his experience in business negotiations. "You release Hansol's parents, leave Earth, and we don't use whatever that device does." The figures made a sound like static on a radio. Were they laughing? "You do not comprehend the situation, Shaquille O'Neal. We are not here to negotiate. We are here to study, to prepare." "Prepare for what?" Shaq asked, though he wasn't sure he wanted to know the answer. "Integration," they said together. "This location is one of many observation posts. We have learned enough. It is time for the next phase." Hansol's eyes widened. "That's what Mom and Dad discovered," he said. "They're not just watching anymore. They're getting ready to take over." The figures moved suddenly, faster than human eyes could follow. One moment they were across the room. The next they were right in front of Shaq and Hansol. Their suits had transformed into something like armor, sleek and shining. But Hansol was ready. He pressed a button on the remote, and a high-pitched sound filled the air. The figures froze in place, their liquid metal forms rippling violently. "Now," Hansol shouted. Shaq didn't hesitate. He grabbed Hansol and ran toward the kitchen, toward the metal staircase that led underground. The figures couldn't move, trapped by whatever signal the remote was producing. At that same moment, Officer Kim and his team burst through the doors. They carried special equipment that glowed with the same light as Hansol's remote. "Containment field activated," Officer Kim shouted. "Move in." The police officers moved with practiced precision, surrounding the frozen figures. They had trained for this, prepared for the day when the observers finally revealed themselves. "Hansol," Officer Kim called out. "Your father's message said you know how to find them." The boy nodded, still holding the remote tightly. "The signal led them here because there's something big underground. Like a spaceship, but invisible to normal scanners. Mom and Dad are down there." The metal staircase in the kitchen began to pulse with light. Something was responding to Hansol's remote, awakening deep beneath the restaurant. "Be careful," the figures said, their voices distorted by the containment field. "What you are about to discover was not meant for human minds to comprehend." Shaq looked at Hansol, then at Officer Kim. They all knew they had to act fast. The containment field wouldn't hold forever, and somewhere below them, Hansol's parents were waiting to be rescued. "I'm going down there," Shaq announced. He had come this far. He couldn't stop now. "Me too," Hansol said firmly. "I can read their symbols. And I have the remote." Officer Kim nodded. "My team will hold them here. But whatever you find down there," he paused, remembering his last encounter with the observers, "just be prepared. They've been here longer than we thought, watching us, learning about us. And now we know why." The metal staircase seemed to respond to Hansol's presence, each step lighting up as he approached. Shaq stayed close to the boy, ready to protect him from whatever they might find below. Behind them, the figure spoke one last time. You cannot stop what is coming. We are everywhere. We are watching. We are ready. Hansel turned back to look at them. But you didn't watch carefully enough, he said. If you did, you'd know that humans don't give up, especially when it comes to family. With those words, Hansel started down the staircase, holding his remote like a flashlight. Shaq followed, ducking his head to fit through the opening. The steps hummed beneath their feet, leading them down into a darkness filled with strange, pulsing lights. Above them, Officer Kim coordinated with his team, making sure the containment field stayed strong. He had waited years for this moment, for the observers to finally make a mistake. And their mistake had been underestimating a 5-year-old boy and a basketball legend. As Shaq and Hansel descended deeper underground, the air became thick with energy. The walls around them were covered in the same symbols Hansel had been drawing, all of them glowing with an inner light. Can you read them? Shaq asked, trying to keep his voice steady. Some of them, Hansel replied. This one means observation, and this one means preparation, and this, he stopped, staring at a large symbol that pulsed with red light. This one means invasion. They had found more than just an observation post. They had discovered the beginning of something much bigger. And somewhere in this underground facility, Hansel's parents were being held, the scientists who had discovered the truth too soon. The staircase ended at a large door covered in moving symbols. Hansel held up his remote, his small face set with determination. Whatever was on the other side of that door, they would face it together. The door began to open, revealing a sight that would change their understanding of the world forever. The door opened to reveal a vast chamber beneath the McDonald's restaurant. The ceiling was high enough that even Shaq felt small. The walls were made of the same liquid metal as the staircase, flowing and shifting like waves in the ocean. But what caught their attention was the giant machine in the center of the room. It looked like a massive sphere, floating in the air without any support. Strange lights moved across its surface, forming and reforming the symbols that Hansel had been drawing. The sphere cast a blue glow over everything, making the chamber feel like it was underwater. Mom, Dad? Hansel called out, his voice echoing in the large space. Over there. Shaq pointed to one side of the chamber, where two people in white lab coats were working at what looked like a control panel. They turned at the sound of Hansel's voice. Hansel. Dr. Keita Park and Dr. Myran Lee called out together. They looked tired but unharmed. However, they didn't move from their positions. They couldn't. Thin bands of light held them in place. Don't come closer, Dr. Park warned. The security systems are active. Hansel held up his remote. I have your device, Dad. The one you found. Dr. Park's eyes widened. The signal disruptor. Hansel pointed at the control panel and pressed the red button. Before Hansel could move, new figures appeared from the walls themselves, forming out of the liquid metal. Unlike the ones upstairs, these didn't bother with human appearances. They were tall, silvery beings with multiple limbs that moved like flowing water. The child has accessed restricted technology, they said in voices that sounded like singing metal. This is unprecedented. The study must be expanded. Shaq stepped in front of Hansel protectively. Nobody's studying anybody, he said firmly. Let his parents go, and leave Earth alone. The beings moved closer, surrounding them in a circle. Your presence here is also unprecedented, Shaquille O'Neal. Our data suggested a very low probability of a sports celebrity becoming involved in first contact. First contact already happened. Dr. Lee called out from her position. When Keita found your device, when we detected your signals, you've been hiding among us for years. Observation requires discretion, the being said. We have learned much about human behavior through this facility. The consumption of food, social interactions, the care of offspring. They turned their featureless faces toward Hansel. Your child has shown remarkable adaptation to our technology. Hansel gripped his remote tighter. "Let my parents go," he said, trying to sound brave. "Or I'll use this." The beans made a sound like wind chimes. "The device you hold was designed for our use. Its effects on this facility would be substantial." "Is that a warning or a hint?" Shaq asked, remembering all the times coaches had told him about opponents' weaknesses in ways that seemed like warnings. Dr. Park caught Shaq's eye and nodded slightly. He understood too. Above them, they could hear the sounds of more police arriving. Officer Kim and his team were securing the area, making sure the observers couldn't escape. "Your law enforcement cannot contain us indefinitely," the being said. "We exist in ways your science cannot comprehend." "Maybe," Dr. Lee said, "but we comprehended enough to find you, to track your signals, to understand your symbols." She looked at her son proudly. "Even our 5-year-old can read your language." The beings moved closer to Hansel, interested. "Show us," they said. "Read the symbols on the sphere." Hansel looked at the giant floating sphere, studying the moving patterns. "That one means gateway," he said, pointing. "And those mean connect and network. And," his voice trembled slightly, "that big one means replace." "Very good," the being said. "Your understanding is impressive. Perhaps we should revise our assessment of human cognitive capabilities." "That's your problem," Shaq said suddenly. "You think you're studying us, but you're not looking at the right things. You watch us eat fast food and talk to each other, but you don't understand what makes us human." The beings turned to him. "Explain." Shaq thought about his basketball career, about all the times people said he couldn't make his free throws, couldn't be a police officer, couldn't be successful in business. "Humans don't give up," he said. "When someone tells us we can't do something, we try harder. When someone threatens our family," he looked at Hansel and his parents, "we fight back." At that moment, Hansel pressed the red button on his remote. A high-pitched sound filled the chamber, and the symbols on the sphere began to flicker. "Warning," a new voice announced, coming from everywhere at once. "Signal disruption detected. Network integrity compromised. Emergency protocols initiated." The vans of light holding Dr. Park and Dr. Lee vanished. They immediately ran to Hansel, wrapping him in a tight hug. "The child has activated emergency shutdown," the beings said, their forms becoming less stable. "This facility will begin deconstruction in 3 minutes." The liquid metal wall started to move faster, rippling violently. The sphere in the center pulsed with red light. "We need to get out of here," Dr. Park said. "When the facility deconstructs, it will take everything inside with it, including any evidence that it ever existed." The beings made no move to stop them. Instead, they began to sink into the walls, becoming part of the liquid metal. "This observation post is compromised," they said, "but there are others. We will continue our work." "Not if we can help it," Dr. Lee said. She pulled out a small device from her lab coat pocket. "We've had 3 days to study your technology, to understand how it works, and to figure out how to track it." The beings paused. "You have exceeded our expectations," they said. "Perhaps further study is required before proceeding with integration." "No more studies," Hansel said firmly. "No more watching. Leave us alone." The chamber began to shake. Parts of the ceiling were dissolving, revealing the McDonald's restaurant above. 2 minutes until complete deconstruction," the automated voice announced. "Run," Shaq shouted. He picked up Hansel, and together with Dr. Park and Dr. Lee, they ran toward the staircase. Behind them, the chamber was collapsing in on itself, the liquid metal walls flowing together like quicksilver. They reached the restaurant just as Officer Kim and his team were pulling back. The entire building was shaking now. "Clear the area," Officer Kim shouted. "Everyone out." They ran into the parking lot, joining the police officers who had formed a perimeter. The McDonald's restaurant glowed with an inner light, the windows blazing like the sun. 1 minute until complete deconstruction. The voice said, now coming from the entire building. Will they come back? Hansol asked his parents. Dr. Park held up Dr. Lee's tracking device. If they do, we'll know. And next time, we'll be ready. The beings' voices echoed one last time across the parking lot. This encounter was educational. We will reconsider our approach to human observation and integration. 30 seconds. The voice counted down. Shaq looked at Hansol and his parents, then at Officer Kim and his team. They had done something incredible today. They had stood up to beings from another world, and they had won. 10 seconds. The restaurant was now entirely made of liquid metal, shining like a mirror in the night. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. There was a flash of light so bright that everyone had to cover their eyes. When they looked again, the McDonald's restaurant was gone. In its place was an empty lot, as if the building had never existed. Officer Kim approached them, holding some kind of scanning device. No residual energy signatures, he said. They're really gone. Hansol held up his remote, but it was now just a piece of ordinary plastic. Whatever power it had contained was gone. So, Shaq said, looking at the empty lot, what happens now? Dr. Park smiled. Now we get ready. They'll think twice before trying anything like this again, but they're still out there, watching, learning. And we'll be watching them back, Dr. Lee added, thanks to what we learned about their technology. Hansol tugged on Shaq's sleeve. Thank you for believing me, he said. Most grown-ups wouldn't have. Shaq knelt down to the boy's level. Thank you for being brave enough to ask for help. You saved your parents, and maybe the whole world. Officer Kim began organizing his team to secure the area. Soon, more government vehicles would arrive to investigate, to gather whatever evidence remained. But for now, they all stood together in the empty parking lot, looking up at the stars. Somewhere up there, the observers were reconsidering their plans for Earth. They had learned an important lesson today. Never underestimate humans, especially when they work together. And it had all started with a whisper from a brave 5-year-old boy in a McDonald's restaurant. 1 month had passed since the incident at McDonald's. The empty lot where the restaurant once stood was now surrounded by a tall fence with future development coming soon signs. But the people who knew the truth understood that nothing would ever be built there. Shaq sat in a comfortable chair in a secret government facility outside Los Angeles. The room looked like a normal office, but the windows were made of special glass that blocked all signals from entering or leaving. Dr. Park and Dr. Lee had helped design it using what they learned from the observer's technology. The tracking system is working perfectly, Dr. Lee said, showing Shaq a large screen on the wall. It displayed a map of the world with small dots of light scattered across it. Each dot is a possible observer location. Thanks to what we learned from their facility, we can now detect their energy signatures. Hansol sat at a small desk nearby, drawing in his notebook. But instead of copying the observer's symbols, he was now creating his own. Dr. Park had discovered that his son had a special talent for understanding alien languages and technology. How many locations have you found? Shaq asked, looking at all the dots on the map. 57 so far, Dr. Park answered. Most of them are disguised as ordinary businesses, restaurants, shopping malls, movie theaters, places where they could watch human social behavior. Officer Kim entered the room, carrying a thick folder. He had been promoted after the incident and now led a special task force dedicated to monitoring the observers' activities. We've made contact with other governments, he reported. Many of them had similar incidents but didn't understand what they were dealing with. Now we're working together, sharing information. Hansol looked up from his drawing. Have they tried to come back? No, his mother said with a smile. I think you scared them, sweetheart. They never expected a child to understand their technology so well. Shaq remembered that night clearly. The liquid metal walls, the floating sphere, the way Hansol had bravely used the remote to shut down their facility. They made a big mistake, he said. They spent all that time watching us, but they didn't understand what makes humans special. The ability to adapt, Dr. Park said, nodding. To work together when faced with a threat. To protect our families. The screen suddenly showed a new alert. A dot was flashing red in a city thousands of miles away. Another facility is shutting down, Officer Kim announced. That's the 7th one this month. They're retreating. Hansol walked over to the screen, studying the pattern of dots. They're not just leaving, he said thoughtfully. They're changing their plan. Everyone turned to look at the boy. In the past month, his insights had proved invaluable. He saw patterns that even the scientists missed. What do you mean? Shaq asked. Hansol pointed to different areas on the map. Look at where they're staying. Schools, libraries, places of learning. I think, he paused, choosing his words carefully. I think they want to understand us better before trying anything again. Dr. Lee checked the data on her computer. He's right. The facilities they're keeping active are all in places focused on education and cultural exchange. So they're not giving up, Officer Kim said. They're just changing their approach. That's what makes them smart, Shaq said, remembering his years of playing basketball. When one strategy doesn't work, you try another. But now we're in the game too. We know they're here, and we're watching them back. A soft beeping sound came from Dr. Park's device, the one they had rebuilt using parts from the observer's facility. The screen showed a message in the aliens' flowing symbols. Hansol read it out loud. Request for dialogue. Peaceful exchange of knowledge. No integration plans. They want to talk. Officer Kim asked, surprised. They want to learn, Dr. Lee corrected. The right way this time. Not by hiding and watching, but by communicating openly. Shaq looked at Hansol, who was already writing a response in the aliens' language. What are you telling them? That we're willing to talk, Hansol said, but only if they follow our rules. No more secret facilities. No more replacing people. And, he smiled, they have to leave McDonald's alone. Everyone laughed at that. Even Officer Kim cracked a smile. Should we trust them? Shaq asked the group. Dr. Park thought for a moment. Trust needs to be earned. They watched us for years without understanding the most important things about humanity. Now they're learning those lessons. Like what happens when you mess with someone's family, Dr. Lee added, hugging Hansol. Or what happens when you underestimate a kid, Shaq said, winking at Hansol. The boy finished writing his message and sent it. The response came almost immediately, a simple symbol that meant agreed. So what now? Officer Kim asked. Now we prepare, Dr. Park said. We set up proper channels for communication. We share knowledge safely, and most importantly, he looked at his son proudly. We teach them who we really are. Hansol went back to his desk and picked up his drawing. He had created a new symbol, one that combined human letters with the observer's flowing style. It meant friendship. Maybe that's what they needed all along, he said. Not to study us like animals in a zoo, but to be our friends. Shaq stood up, his head almost touching the ceiling of the secure room. You know what's funny? He said. All of this started because I wanted a Big Mac. Everyone laughed again. It felt good to laugh, to release the tension of the past month. They had faced something incredible together, and they had come through it stronger. Outside the facility, the sun was setting over Los Angeles. Somewhere up there, the observers were watching. Not in secret anymore, but with a new understanding and respect for humanity. They had learned that humans were more than just subjects to study. They were beings capable of great courage, intelligence, and compassion. And it had all started with a whisper in a McDonald's restaurant, when a brave 5-year-old boy trusted a basketball legend with an incredible secret. Sometimes the biggest changes in the universe begin with the smallest actions, and the most important lessons come from the most unexpected teachers. As they left the facility that evening, Shaq looked down at Hansol. Want to get some dinner? I know a good burger place. Hansol grinned. Maybe Chinese food instead. Everyone laughed one more time. Some things had definitely changed, but the important things, family, friendship, and courage, remained the same. And somewhere in the vast universe, the observers were learning these lessons too, one human interaction at a time.